am William E. Kennedy, known to my friends here in Jonesborough as Bill Kennedy. My family and I moved to Jonesborough in 1973. We had lived for a year in Johnson City and had been attracted to Johnson City for a professional opportunity. We were looking for a college town of medium size, and Johnson City seemed to be the right place and certainly provided the right medical community and the right opportunity for orthopedic surgery. I made a trip to Johnson City in 1971 looking for housing for my family, and told the real estate person who was helping me that I was interested in an old house. He took me to a few houses, one built in about 1933 and the other built in 1948. And keep in mind, this was 1971. I said, try 1848. He said, well, Johnson City wasn't even founded until 1869. So he was frustrated and I was frustrated. We parted one day, and the next morning he came and said, there's a widow in a town called Jonesborough who would like to sell her house complete with its antique furnishings, but I've just assumed that Jonesborough would be too far away. Well, how far away is Jonesborough from Johnson City, I asked. He said 8 or 9 miles. I said, well, what kind of a highway? 4-lane. I said, let's go. Let's look at it. So he brought me down west on 11E, the same route that we still use today, primarily in getting from Johnson City to Jonesborough, and we turned to the left on Boone Street just as we do today, and we stopped at the stop sign on Main Street, and by the time I had seen that much of Jonesborough back in 1971, I was thrilled with what I saw. He turned to the right, took me in front of the courthouse, and by the time we were at the courthouse, seeing no more of Jonesborough than that, I was in love with this town because I could see through the rundown buildings, the buildings that were in need of repair, and also many of the buildings that were vacant at that time. I could see the beauty in those buildings. Well, the house that we ultimately bought did not become available until 1973, when we bought 400 West Main Street from the Hacker family. We were only the second family to own that house, which had been built in 1869. We were really quite excited about the opportunity to own such a historic property. It naturally needed some work. I was aware, and my wife was aware, that 19th century masonry houses needed some special attention for maintenance, that if we used modern maintenance and modern techniques, it could do damage to the houses. We didn't have to look around Jonesborough very much in order to see inappropriate modern masonry repairs that had been done on some of the buildings that just were eyesores, if nothing else. And so after we got settled in our house, we had a wonderful contractor who was very much a traditionalist in repairing properties, who knew a lot about what we later came to call historic preservation, and taught us a lot about how to respectfully treat and repair 19th century buildings. That knowledge grew in my mind, and I became involved in an educational effort sponsored by the Jonesborough Civic Trust in the mid-1970s, and later was appointed to the Historic Zoning Commission in 1980 by the mayor of Jonesborough. And I've been on the Historic Zoning Commission since then for the past 30 years and have been its chairman for 27 years. And in all of that effort, my primary interest has been to help people learn how to properly repair and restore the historic properties here in Jonesborough. One of the other things that I discovered in my interest in becoming involved in the community, though, was the fascinating fact that became apparent to me that the downtown, the central business district, was literally dying in the late 60s and early 1970s. I had a wonderful conversation with the owner of the Jonesborough hardware store at the time, as we were getting settled in our house in 1973, I tried to buy as much as I could locally, of course, to try to support the downtown businesses. And the owner told me one time when I was in buying some hardware that he thought the downtown was dying, and he said the reason that it seemed to be dying was because they could not compete with the mall in Johnson City or with modern strip malls in terms of parking and convenience, and also in terms of square footage. He pointed out that he had the largest square footage commercial building in the central business district in Jonesborough, and yet by modern day standards of the 1970s, that was too small to really be viable commercially. And so he expected the downtown to die, quite literally, from an economic point of view. But the people in Jonesborough who were here before I came, and also the people who inspired me to participate in the revitalization of the community, realized that we could use the shops, we could adapt the shops in Jonesborough of low square footage to specialized businesses, and again begin to build a future economically in downtown Jonesborough based on specialized mom and pop businesses. Also, we realized that tourism would be a good backbone of the economy because we had historic Jonesborough. We had a place of buildings that were of museum quality where authentic history occurred, and those buildings were authentic even though they were in bad need of repair, many of them. And so we thought we could build a historic district, we could adapt the historic district to businesses that would fit the square footage and that could survive economically. And so we started out, really, people before I came here had started, and I was privileged to join in the effort with many other people. As together as a community, we built Jonesborough, built its future on its past as a historic community. Jonesborough was laid out and chartered by the legislature of North Carolina in 1779 as a central location where water was available. That was an important point, where there could be legal services and governmental services for the Overmountain men back when we were still a part of the state of North Carolina. That grew then into an attempt at statehood in the state of Franklin, which did not pass. But later, of course, in 1796, I believe was the year, became the state of Tennessee. The town plat that was actually laid out in acre lots in 1779 is still the grid of which Jonesborough is built in its historic central part. The selection of the site where water was available meant that it was in a low area and it was surrounded by hills which formed a geological bowl, which the central business district is located in the bottom of that bowl, and the residential area is built on the hills surrounding the bottom of that bowl, with two areas along Spring Street and Boone Street being lower areas for entry into the geological bowl. The nice thing about that is that it provided a logical area for boundary for the historic district, and it also provided visual continuity around the central business district of Jonesborough. So you may wonder, how does historic zoning actually help a town revitalize and preserve a town? When the leaders of Jonesborough passed their historic zoning ordinance in 1970, they established a historic zoning commission, which at that time was made up of 5 members. Since then it's been expanded to 9 members. And they, under enabling legislation from the state of Tennessee, established a system whereby anyone who repaired a building or did work on a building or built a new building inside the designated historic zone had to have their changes in the building or their new construction that they planned approved by the Historic Zoning Commission using certain guidelines established by the Historic Zoning Commission with the approval of the town board in establishing those guidelines in order for the property owner to get a building permit and be able to do work on a particular building. And as the years went by, through the 70s and on into the 80s and even early 90s, the Historic Zoning Commission grew in its work and its understanding of its work and in its technique as to how to carry out the work, and developed guidelines that are now in writing that give a property owner an idea of what would be permitted in the historic district for the exteriors of buildings that are in the historic district. And actually the guidelines apply whether a building is considered to be contributing to the historic character of the area or not. When people have come to the Historic Zoning Commission, for example the old Jonesborough High School, and asked that such a building be demolished, or the house at 300 West Main Street, and asked that that be demolished, the Commission was able to legally say no, it cannot be demolished because it is an important part of the historic town, the historic character of Jonesborough. And that enabled us to get those buildings that I just mentioned and other buildings in town into the hands of property owners who were willing to restore them, restoring them in such a way that they could meet modern needs and continue to be enjoyed and continue to be used in present-day modern society. So that, in a nutshell, is really the technique that we've used through the years in preserving the various buildings here in Jonesborough. The town led the way, the town government led the way in passing that ordinance. And since then, they've also led the way in, for example, in 1975, arranging through a series of grants to put the wires underground for the telephone wires and the power lines, and to get rid of the power poles, and to build our modern, old-fashioned looking brick sidewalks and stone curbs, and to establish our old-fashioned looking but modern lights for our street lights. Those lights, by the way, have been modeled after the lanterns that were in Jonesborough and the Central Business District in the 1880s, manufactured by the Welsbach Company. Now, through the past 40 years, we've had increasing numbers of people who have come to live in the historic district, who also contribute in many, many ways to the maintenance of the historic district. It's been one of the most interesting things to me to be chairman of the Historic Zoning Commission for the past 27 years, that during the 1980s, I often had objections from property owners who seemed to resist the work of the Historic Zoning Commission, who would not approve certain things or who would approve other things, changes in the exteriors of the various buildings in town. Now that has turned around so that for the past 10 to 15 years, I have seen increasingly property owners who have, if anything, gotten upset with the Historic Zoning Commission when they felt the Historic Zoning Commission was being too liberal and approving requests from property owners that other property owners felt should not have been approved. Now we have a population of people who live here in Jonesborough who realize that the historic district is fragile and who want to see it very well protected and very well taken care of, and they expect the Historic Zoning Commission to look after the fragile nature of the historic district.
Were you all experts in this when you walked in on it?
No, we were not experts at all. One of the things that the Civic Trust did, for which I'm very thankful, is to help sponsor, in fact they sponsored and organized, historic preservation conferences each spring for a series of about 8 years through the 1970s and early 1980s, in which we were able to recruit professionals in various aspects of historic preservation to come with visitors and participants from all over the country who paid the bills, incidentally, and taught us proper preservation techniques. And we have continued to promote proper preservation techniques in recent years through the Heritage Alliance and through the services of the preservationist who's on the staff of the Heritage Alliance, and also through the work of the Historic Zoning Commission, so that we now network for property owners not only materials and techniques of proper maintenance of historic buildings, but also we keep lists in our computers of people who are willing to do specialized historic preservation and restoration work, people who are capable and knowledgeable along those lines and who are glad to do that work for property owners. Most of the buildings have been pretty well adaptively reused and restored in such a way as to keep their historic character, but at the same time bring them up to modern standards in terms of their function. Actually, in the past 10 to 20 years, we've gotten into the point that we're going through the cycle of having restored certain buildings, and now they need to be renewed again as they've gradually deteriorated again and need to be brought back up. So we're in a maintenance cycle now in our historic preservation phase here in Jonesborough. And I think we have been for the past 10 or 20 years for many of our buildings. What we're finding is that people are learning more and more to care for the buildings every year by doing small maintenance needs, meeting small maintenance needs and keeping them up to date by doing a little bit every year or two rather than letting them run down.